In the picturesque town of Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and a sparkling river, lived a young man named Eli Turner. Eli was on the cusp of adulthood, having just turned 18, and his life was about to take a dramatic turn. His father, Samuel Turner, a respected FBI agent, had given him a gift that would change everything: a magnificent German shepherd named Luna. Luna was more than just a pet. She was a symbol of Eli's transition into adulthood, a companion to guide him through the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. Her glossy black and tan coat shimmered in the sunlight, and her alert eyes missed nothing. Eli had always loved dogs, and Luna was the perfect embodiment of intelligence, loyalty, and strength. One sunny afternoon, Eli decided to take Luna for a walk through the quiet neighborhood streets of Willow Creek. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the warmth of the sun matched the excitement in Eli's heart. Luna trotted obediently beside him, her tail wagging enthusiastically as they moved in sync, a bond already forming between them. As they walked, Eli couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He had spent the past few days teaching Luna tricks and commands, and she had proven to be incredibly well-trained and intelligent. Passers-by would occasionally glance at them, admiring the magnificent dog and the young man who walked with such confidence. The peaceful walk was abruptly interrupted when a police cruiser slowed to a stop near the curb. Eli glanced up, his steps faltering as the driver's door opened and Officer Daniels stepped out. Officer Daniels was well known in Willow Creek, his reputation for arrogance and prejudice preceding him. He stood there for a moment, saying nothing, his gaze lingering on Luna. "Nice dog," Officer Daniels finally said, his tone laced with condescension. "Who's paying you to walk him?" Eli was taken aback by the question. "No one, sir," he replied respectfully. "She's mine, a gift from my dad." Officer Daniels scoffed, his laughter echoing through the street. "This dog," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "How could someone like you afford her?" Eli's grip on Luna's leash tightened instinctively. He frowned, his earlier excitement now replaced by a sinking feeling. "She's mine," he repeated, his voice low but steady. "My dad gave her to me." The officer's smile widened, his laughter replaced with suspicion. "You're telling me you own this dog?" he demanded, stepping closer. "So you stole her then?" Eli's heart pounded in his chest. The accusation sent a chill through him. He tried to protest, his voice trembling but insistent. "No, I didn't steal her. She's not stolen. She's mine." Officer Daniels' movements grew more aggressive as he loomed closer. "If she's yours, prove it," he challenged. Frustrated by the officer's refusal to believe him, Eli knelt beside Luna. He wanted to show how well-trained she was, how connected they already were. With a calm but confident voice, he issued one of the commands he had practiced with Luna earlier that morning. Luna barked once, obediently and enthusiastically, just as Eli had taught her. The sound of the bark seemed to trigger something in Officer Daniels. His hand shot to the gun holstered at his hip, and he drew it instantly. His voice rose, sharp and defensive, as he accused Eli of trying to sick the dog on him. "No!" Eli shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "It's not like that. You're misunderstanding." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. The tension in the air seemed to spiral out of control. Seeing the drawn weapon and the officer's aggressive stance, Luna barked again, this time louder and more agitated. The loyal dog could sense her owner's fear and tried to respond, her body tensing as if ready to protect Eli. "Stop!" Eli yelled, panic seizing him as he pulled hard on the leash, trying to calm Luna down. "She's not attacking you. Please." The words were ignored. Officer Daniels' gun remained steady, his finger tightening on the trigger. In a split second, the shot rang out, the crack of the gun echoing down the street louder than Eli could have imagined. Time seemed to slow as he watched Luna collapse to the ground, the life draining from her eyes. Eli dropped to his knees immediately, the leash slipping from his trembling hands as he reached for his fallen friend. "Luna," he cried, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face as he cradled the dog's head in his arms. Luna's breaths came shallow and weak, and Eli whispered apologies through his sobs, his grief too great to bear. Officer Daniel's voice cut through the moment, cold and accusing. "You tried to make that dog attack me," he said flatly, as if his actions had been justified. "You're under arrest for harassment and endangering an officer." Eli couldn't believe what he was hearing. The grief and shock left him unable to respond as the officer grabbed his arm roughly, pulling him to his feet. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Eli barely registered what was happening as Officer Daniels led him to the police cruiser, his gaze remaining fixed on Luna, whose body lay motionless on the sidewalk. The dog's glossy coat no longer gleamed in the sunlight, and the street, which had been so full of life just minutes before, now felt silent and empty. At the police station, Eli sat alone in a cold, dimly lit holding room, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. He rested his hands on the stark metal table in front of him, the surface reflecting the tears streaming down his face. Everything that had happened felt surreal. The baseless accusations, the drawn weapon, and now the shock of being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. The door creaked open, and a uniformed officer entered the room. His expression was blank, his demeanor cold, as he dropped a folder onto the table without preamble. He demanded Eli's identification. Eli, his voice shaky and barely audible, managed to respond. He reached into his pocket as much as his restraints allowed and handed over his ID. The officer took it without so much as a glance at Eli, briefly inspecting the card before sliding it back across the table. "I want to make a phone call," Eli said weakly, his voice cracking with exhaustion and tears. The officer stared at him for a moment, then sighed without saying anything. He left the room again, returning a minute later with a phone. He placed it on the table and unfastened one of Eli's cuffs so he could dial. Eli's hands were trembling as he reached for the phone, his fingers struggling to hit the correct buttons. After a few rings, his father picked up. Samuel Turner's voice was sharp, immediately alert. The sound of his father's voice broke whatever resolve Eli had left. "Dad," he sobbed, the tears falling harder now. "They shot Luna. The officer said I made her attack, but I didn't. I swear I didn't do anything. He accused me of stealing her, and then—" Eli's words caught in his throat as he tried to hold back his cries. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by Samuel's steady voice, calm, but with an undercurrent of fury. "Where are you right now?" Samuel asked, his tone leaving no room for doubt that he already had a plan. "I'm at the police station," Eli replied in a whisper. Samuel's voice sharpened further. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." Eli nodded silently, even though his father couldn't see him. The call ended with a click, and Eli set the phone back on the table, his hands still shaking. The officer, watching him closely, didn't say anything as he cuffed Eli's hand back to the chair and took the phone away. For what felt like an eternity, Eli sat alone again. The silence in the room became heavier, the hum of the lights louder. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower than it should, every passing second feeling like an hour. Every noise in the hallway outside sent a jolt of hope through him that someone, anyone, was coming to set things right. Finally, the sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed through the station. The door to the holding room remained closed, but Eli could hear his father's unmistakable voice booming from the front of the station. "Where is my son?" Samuel Turner's voice rang out with authority, the words sharp and cutting through the air like a blade. Officers nearby scrambled to respond, their voices hushed as they tried to explain the situation. It wasn't long before the senior officer on duty, Captain Harris, stepped forward to try to calm him. "Agent Turner, please calm down," Captain Harris said, his voice placating as he approached. "What's the issue here?" Samuel didn't waver. His tall frame was tense with anger. His face sat in a deep scowl as he glared at the senior officer. "Where is my son?" he demanded, each word slow and deliberate. Captain Harris gestured quickly to the holding rooms. "He's in there. He was arrested for—" Before he could finish, Samuel cut him off. "Explain to me why my son was arrested." Captain Harris's voice faltered slightly under the weight of Samuel's glare. "The officer involved said he attempted to make a dog attack him. Samuel's expression darkened further, his voice a low growl as he spoke. "That's not what happened. He told me what happened. Your officer accused him of stealing his own dog and then pulled a weapon. Who gave that officer the right to shoot an innocent animal?" Captain Harris looked taken aback, but quickly tried to regain control. "I'll get Officer Daniels in here to explain himself," he said, his tone more cautious now. Moments later, Officer Daniels entered the room. His demeanor was relaxed, his hands casually tucked into his pockets as though nothing significant had happened. He offered a slight nod to Captain Harris before turning to Samuel with an air of indifference. "Care to explain why you arrested my son?" Samuel asked, his voice steady, though his eyes burned with fury. Officer Daniels shrugged. "Your kid provoked the dog to attack me. I shot it for my safety. End of story," he said flatly, his words dripping with self-justification. Samuel didn't blink. "That's not what my son told me," he replied evenly. "And, judging by the way you're talking, I think you're lying." The tension in the room thickened, but before Officer Daniels could argue, Captain Harris interjected. "Let's check the CCTV footage," he suggested, his voice cautious as he tried to calm the brewing storm. "It'll show us exactly what happened." Samuel didn't respond to the suggestion, but his expression made it clear he wouldn't settle for anything less than the truth. He stood silently as Captain Harris gave orders to retrieve the footage, his sharp gaze never leaving Officer Daniels. The officer, for the first time, seemed to falter slightly under the weight of Samuel's stare. In the quiet that followed, Eli remained in the holding room, unaware of the confrontation taking place on his behalf. His mind stayed fixed on Luna, his loyal companion who had only wanted to protect him. He closed his eyes as tears slipped down his cheeks, grief and helplessness weighing him down. Outside the room, however, Samuel Turner was just getting started. The senior officers gathered in a small, dimly lit conference room where the CCTV footage from the nearby street had been queued up on a large screen. The tension in the room was thick as Samuel Turner, Officer Daniels, Captain Harris, and several other personnel stood silently, waiting for the truth to unfold. The video began to play, the grainy but clear footage flickering across the screen. It showed Eli walking peacefully down the sidewalk with Luna, the German Shepherd happily trotting beside him on the leash. Eli's posture was relaxed, his attention focused on his dog as they moved along the quiet street. Then the moment came. Officer Daniels' cruiser appeared on the edge of the screen, pulling up alongside Eli. The officer could be seen stepping out of the vehicle and approaching the teenager. The footage didn't include sound, but the body language spoke volumes. Officer Daniels stood in front of Eli, his posture towering and confrontational as he gestured toward Luna. The room remained silent as everyone watched closely. The video clearly showed Eli gesturing back, likely trying to explain himself. The teenager's face, even in the low resolution, was full of confusion and tension. Luna, in the video, stood calmly at Eli's side, her tail swishing lightly as she waited for her owner's next command. Moments later, Eli crouched slightly, issuing a command, and Luna barked in response. A quick, obedient action, nothing remotely resembling aggression. But then Officer Daniels' reaction played out in stark detail. He reached for his holstered gun, his body language tense and hostile. The watching officers inhaled sharply as the footage showed Eli flinching back in alarm. Luna's demeanor changed as well. The loyal dog began barking defensively, sensing her owner's fear and the officer's aggression. The barking escalated, but even then, the footage clearly showed the dog's restrained behavior. She didn't lunge, she didn't attack, and she remained on her leash. Then came the shot. The entire room stiffened as the video played the exact moment Officer Daniels fired his weapon. Luna's body crumpled to the ground, the leash falling limply from Eli's shaking hand. Eli dropped to his knees beside the dog, his sobs visible even without sound as he cradled Luna's motionless form. The footage ended abruptly, freezing on the image of Eli kneeling on the sidewalk, his face hidden by the shadows, his shoulders shaking with grief. For a long moment, no one said a word. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the screen as the still image remained. Samuel Turner stood at the front, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on Captain Harris, his face like stone, impassive yet brimming with barely restrained fury. The senior officer, Captain Harris, finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat, though his voice carried a noticeable edge of discomfort. He turned toward Officer Daniels, his expression stern and unrelenting. "Well," he demanded, "does this match the story you gave me earlier?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the evidence. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with visible unease. He opened his mouth as though to explain, but found no words. I thought she was going to attack," he muttered weakly, though his voice carried little conviction. Samuel took a step forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the room. His voice was low and measured, but every word carried the weight of his fury. "The footage speaks for itself," he said coldly. "My son was walking his own dog, minding his own business. This officer profiled him, accused him of theft without cause, and drew a weapon on a loyal animal that was doing nothing but responding to its owner. And then he arrested my son for his own reckless action." He turned his gaze directly onto Captain Harris, his sharp eyes piercing through the senior officer's discomfort. "What are you going to do about this?" Captain Harris straightened his back, his lips pressed into a thin line. He turned toward Officer Daniels with a look that left no room for argument. "This is clear misconduct," he stated firmly. "You overreacted and you used unnecessary force. You've disgraced this department." Officer Daniels' face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as he fumbled for a defense. I thought I was in danger," he repeated weakly, though it was clear no one in the room believed him. Samuel shook his head, his voice cutting through Daniels' feeble words. "My son's life was never a threat to you, and that dog, that was his best friend," he said, his voice hardening further as he added, "You don't get to hide behind excuses. Not this time." Captain Harris stepped forward, his decision clear. "Officer Daniels, you're relieved of duty effective immediately, pending a full review of this incident," he announced. "You'll be suspended without pay while the department conducts its investigation." Officer Daniels looked stunned, as though unable to process the consequences unfolding before him. His shoulders slumped as Captain Harris's words sank in. Samuel wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Captain Harris, his voice calm but deadly serious. "Suspension isn't enough," he said. "I'm filing a formal complaint for misconduct, negligence, and false arrest. My son will not carry the weight of your officer's actions." Captain Harris nodded solemnly. "Understood, Agent Turner. The department will fully cooperate with your complaint and the investigation." With that, Samuel turned on his heel and left the room without another word. Every officer in the room remained silent, watching him go. Outside the conference room, Eli sat quietly in the hallway, his head still hung low when Samuel approached. He gently rested a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. Eli looked up, his red-rimmed eyes meeting his father's. "They saw the truth," Samuel said quietly, his voice softening. "This isn't over, but I promise you, you're not alone in this." Eli nodded, the faintest hint of relief flickering across his face, though Luna's loss still weighed heavily on his heart. Knowing the truth was coming to light brought a glimmer of comfort as they left the station together. Samuel's resolve was unwavering. He would see this through, not just for Eli, but to ensure that justice was served. The case proceeded swiftly to court, where the events of that tragic day were laid bare for all to see. Eli sat quietly alongside his father, Samuel, in the courtroom, his shoulders tense as the proceedings began. Officer Daniels stood at the defendant's table, his face grim but defiant. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting the evidence. The CCTV footage now played on a large screen before the judge, revealing every moment: the peaceful walk, the unprovoked confrontation, and ultimately the devastating shot that ended Luna's life. The courtroom remained silent as the video played, the room heavy with the weight of what it showed. Eli sat still, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, as he watched the events replayed yet again. Though painful, the footage was undeniable proof of his innocence. Witnesses took the stand one by one, including Samuel, who recounted Eli's tearful call and the actions that led to his wrongful arrest. Each testimony added more weight to the truth, dismantling Officer Daniels' initial claims. The prosecution painted a clear picture of prejudice, negligence, and unnecessary escalation. When Officer Daniels was finally called to testify, his earlier arrogance had begun to fade under questioning. He tried to defend his actions, claiming that he had acted out of self-defense and confusion. However, the footage and evidence left his arguments weak and hollow. The courtroom listened in cold silence as his justification unraveled further with each question. The judge, having seen and heard enough, addressed the room with finality. His voice was calm but resolute as he delivered his verdict. The court found Officer Daniels guilty of using unnecessary force and engaging in professional misconduct. Eli's arrest was declared unlawful, and all accusations against him were officially dismissed. Officer Daniels' punishment was clear. He was suspended from duty for 1 month without pay and placed under internal review, with his future in law enforcement left uncertain. The judge's ruling, though measured, reflected the court's acknowledgement of wrongdoing. After the gavel fell and the proceedings concluded, Samuel stood beside Eli as they exited the courthouse. A quiet crowd had gathered outside, many waiting to hear the outcome. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, but Samuel ignored them, keeping his focus on his son. Eli walked with his head held high, though his expression remained somber. Samuel placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder as they moved through the crowd. He leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "What happened to Luna wasn't right," he said softly, "but we made sure they couldn't bury the truth. That matters." Eli nodded, his gaze fixed ahead, though the court's decision had brought accountability. It did little to ease the ache in his chest. Luna's absence was a void that could not be filled, and the memory of his loyal companion's final moments weighed heavily on his heart. They reached a quieter part of the street, away from the noise and flashing cameras. Samuel stopped and turned to face Eli fully. "What happened to Luna wasn't right," he said softly, "but we made sure they couldn't bury the truth. That matters." Eli swallowed hard, the grief still raw in his eyes. He met his father's gaze and nodded again, understanding the significance of what they had achieved together. They had faced injustice head-on and fought to hold those responsible accountable. Able as they walked forward, father and son side by side, Eli allowed himself a moment to breathe. Though Luna was gone, the fight for justice had not been in vain. In a world where prejudice could steal so much, Eli and his father had proven that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth standing for.